日本の
On May 15th, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced his government's basic stance on how Japan will exercise its right to collective self-defense. Collective self-defense is the right, empowered by a UN charter to all nations. Japan was defeated in the Second World War. Following the war, Japan established Article 9 of its pacifist constitution, which says that armed forces with war potential may not be maintained. But Prime Minister Abe has forged ahead with his collective self-defense push to reinterpret Japan's pacifist constitution. Japan's push for collective self-defense. Will it benefit the security situation in Northeast Asia, or will it be another risk factor stoking tension in the region?
You're watching Arirang TV's Upfront. Welcome to the program. I'm Hyun-kyung.
Hello, I'm Yoo Jong-soo. On today's Upfront, we discuss Japan's right to practice collective self-defense and how it fits in with the security matters surrounding Korean Peninsula.
And to help us with today's discussion, we have Dr. Shin Chang-hoon, the director of the Center for Global Governance at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and Dr. Daniel Pinkston, the Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Good to have you both with us today.
Thank you very much for
Great to be here. What do you think Japan's true motives are when it comes to lifting its self-imposed ban on the right to collective self-defense, and what kind of impact will it bring to security situation in the region?
Well, actually, the panel report released on the 15th of May this year explains that Japan is, facing a lot of security environment changes in the Northeast Asia because of the rise of China and the progress of weapons and technologies. So, however, it is a little bit nominal, excuses for the exercise of the right of self-defense. The major reasons for this kind of lifting up the ban on the exercise of the right of self-defense, collective defense, is kind of strengthening U.S.-Japan alliance because, as you know, for instance, because of the provocations on the surrounding the Senkaku Islands, the U.S.-Japan alliance becomes much more important. Sudden establishment of the Adis of China has also, initiated this kind of concerns from Japan.
And Dr. Pinkston, do you have any opinions on that?
Well, I think that's right. I agree with Dr. Shin. There's a changing security environment. China's military modernization. Some would say that an arms race has begun in East Asia. And of course, we have North Korea's nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and other asymmetric threats, a number of unresolved maritime disputes. So the security environment is changing. The threat perceptions are changing. So Japan is trying to deal with these issues within the constraints of its constitution and legal environment.
Now, in his press conference, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said, this is what he said. He said, the basis of security lies in resolutely ensuring the nation's safety. And it's implied that then without this right, Japan is less safe. What's your take on his remarks?
Well, that is correct. Any state leader has the ultimate responsibility of protecting its citizens and its sovereign territory, right? And that's in the UN Charter. The right to protect yourself is granted to every UN member. So that's correct. But how you enforce that right and how you protect your sovereignty and your citizens, then it all comes down to the details, of course.
And Dr. Shin, what do you think about Prime Minister Abe's comments?
Well, actually, in order to answer these questions, I think we, including this program watchers, need to understand the clear definition of the collective self-defense. Well, actually, even experts are confused. For instance, because of the term self-defense, the collective self-defense deals only with the collective defense of self, But it's not true. It includes the collective defense of others as well. For instance, well,
Allies.
yes, right, allies. Well, for instance, well, if you look at the French version of the United Nations Charter, it says défense légitime, which can be translated legitimate defense, not self-defense. But the thing is that, well, if Japan is really concerned about their national security, then Japan will be interested in the collective defense of self rather than collective defense of others. But the thing is that, well, the emergency situation in other territory may have impact on the Japan's national interest. And we can't talk about the, Japan's right of collective self-defense. But the thing is that, well, the Constitution, pacifist Constitution bans this kind of exercise of collective defense of others.
Japan has frequently mentioned the, in case of emergency situation regarding its collective self-defense, what exactly meet the standards, and who will be the one to make these decisions?
Right. There's a fine line between how we define in case of emergency.
Yes, that's a very good question and very important question. But first, to follow up what Dr. Shin said, as far as this collective self-defense, there's a paradox in here because Japan's security is fundamentally grounded in its alliance relationship with the U.S. And there are a number of military capabilities that Japan has foregone in exchange for relying upon this alliance relationship with the U.S. So if the U.S. security, if U.S. security was undermined or degraded, it would have this impact upon Japan's national security. So there's kind of a natural understanding, at least for me personally, although there's some legal questions. Now, as far as the decisions on who invokes the right to use force and under certain emergency conditions, these are very, very important questions. This is being raised in Japan right now because the LDP cannot push this forward unilaterally in the Diet. It needs Diet approval and consensus in Japan and in the Japanese government. And its coalition partner, the new Komeito, has questions about this. And now the debate has been put off until next spring. And their coalition partner is raising a lot of these questions, which I think is very important because we have to ask when and how force would be used or potentially be used, and to do what? What are you trying to achieve? So if we're trying to achieve the maintenance of public goods and security senses, such as maritime security, shipping, counter-proliferation, counter-piracy, counter-terrorism action, search and rescue, these kinds of things, I think everyone can agree that those are in the interests of the security of all actors. So we have to have this debate, and I think it's a healthy development.
So technically speaking, Japan has never exercised this right since World War II then?
Right, that's right. Because of its constitutional law. However, as I already mentioned, there is an aspect of collective defense of others. In that case, there is a certain preconditions when deciding the emergencies. In accordance of the jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, especially in the cases concerning military and paramilitary activities in and against Nicaragua, the court clearly indicated that the state which are under armed attack has the right to determine whether it's emergency or not. So when it comes to the, collective defense of others, the other states which are under armed attack has the right to decide whether it's emergency or not. So the Japan doesn't have any right to decide whether it's emergency or not.
So in this case, if the U.S., Japan's ally, determines that it's an emergency situation, then Japan will be able to, if they reinterpret the Constitution, then they will be able to exercise this right.
But the thing is that, well, the decision must be done by the victim states of armed conflict, not Japan and the United States, even though they are in the relations of the alliance.
Okay, That's fair enough. But I think the concern here is that who is to say then Japan will not, 60, 70 years down the road, will not start another war? I think that's some of the concerns that are being raised in South Korea at this point.
Yes, some of those concerns I think are emotional reactions or maybe overreactions. Certainly I understand the concerns, I understand the historical legacies, and I agree personally that Japan has not handled the historical issues very well at all. But again, I think we really have to come back to the fact that Japan today and Japan of the 1930s is a very different country. Japan is a democracy. For the most part, Japanese citizens are peace-loving. They do not want to go to war. And any democratically elected leader of Japan is not going to take aggressive actions such as Japan did in the 1930s. So it's a different time, a different era, a different country. So I think we have to look at this from a different perspective. And to have this debate and to think about it is very important now. And it's also this issue of collective defense is very important. I think Dr. Shin brought up some of the legal issues, but also Japan's defense and national security could impact potentially South Korea's national security. And if in fact there were a second Korean War, for example, the U.S. under the United Nations Command has agreements with Japan. There are, I believe it's 7 bases or so that would provide logistic support to a response to a North Korean invasion, for example. So if those bases or those facilities, let's say, came under attack, let's say missile strikes from North Korea, it would degrade South Korea's security as well. So it's important to think of this in terms of the complex security threats of the modern age from both state and non-state actors. There are a number of scenarios where it could have these types of consequences.
So with emotional strings detached, you think this will actually benefit the Korean Peninsula or the South Korea?
Well, it depends. I think it's to use certain military capabilities to do what? We have to look at areas where national security interests converge. I think there's a lot of overlap where, for example, the U.S., Japan, and South Korea have a lot of common interests in maintaining security in the region, and there's a lot of room for cooperation. So we have to separate the emotions and the historical problems, which I agree are problematic, and those have to be resolved. And of course, they are linked; they're not completely separate. But I think we have to move forward in a positive way that benefits the regional security overall.
Any thoughts on this, Dr. Shin?
I think, well, Dr. Pinkston raised the very important issues because, for instance, in the Korean War, Japan provided logistics to the U.S. armies. So what we have to think at this moment is that what is the real interests of the United States under the context of the alliance between Japan and the United States? It is not the, dispatch of the military units to Korean Peninsula if something happens. I think it is kind of providing logistics that the United States wants. So I think in that sense, well, the unilateral, interpretation of the constitutional law, which allows for the collective self-defense, is a little bit, awkward situation when it comes to the alliance between Japan and the United States.
And we will talk about this shortly. Before we do, though, the key players, of course, involved in this region in this case is the U.S., China, and South Korea. So this is how the three nations reacted to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's comments.
U.S. President Barack Obama officially welcomed Japan's move to re-examine its self-imposed ban on collective self-defense. Directly after Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's press conference, Chinese President Xi Jinping indirectly delivered a strong message to Japan. And the Korean government has emphasized that Japan should secure the Korean government's explicit approval if it ever wishes to exercise its collective self-defense right on the Korean Peninsula.
Japan should dispel doubts and concerns shared by its neighboring countries as it moves closer to exercising the right to collective self-defense. We reiterated that there should be a request from us or our consent when it comes to issues related to security on the Korean Peninsula and national interests.
Right, so we can see that Washington supports Tokyo's move. Was this expected? Why would the U.S. agree with Japan's move in this case?
I think, well, the lifting of the banning on the collective self-defense will be beneficial to the defense budget of the United States and the Northeast Asia as well. So I think this is a very important aspect because even though, well, U.S. always argued that we have pivot Asia policies or rebalancing policies in Northeast Asia, but they didn't do much things in the Northeast Asia. So they need a actual, assistance from the key players in the Northeast Asia, like Japan and South Korea. So in that sense, well, Shinzo Abe taking, risking his political destiny, he has agreed to supply, military assistance to the United States voluntarily, even though the, security agreement between, bilateral security agreement between U.S. and Japan does not mention any kind of, military assistance to the United States if a certain emergency situation happened in the territory of the United States.
Personally, I work for an international organization, but I'm an American citizen, so I can just tell you a scenario that is difficult for Americans to understand, let's say, in the context of the defense treaty with Japan. The constraints and the against collective self-defense. Let's say there's a scenario where U.S. territory is under a missile attack, or there's a missile launched at U.S. territory. Under the constitutional constraints and the legal interpretations now, let's say Japan has the capability to have a sea-based mid-course missile interceptor, and they would have a shot at a missile that's heading towards U.S. territory. Let's say North Korea were to launch a missile at Guam, or Seattle, or something like that, or Alaska, and Japan could not try to intercept that missile, or could not fire a shot at that missile, and it were to strike the U.S. territory. This is pretty much unacceptable for most Americans, and why that would be prohibited. So those types of things, I think there are certain scenarios or cases where it would make absolute sense, where it's in the security interests of these three actors involved, Japan, Korea, and the United States, to enable Japanese self-defense forces to take an active role if, let's say, a ship were captured by pirates or North Korean special forces on the high seas, and Japanese self-defense forces could respond to that kind of action. Any kind of terrorist attack. There are a number of different scenarios where it would make sense, I think, and it would enhance the security situation for these partners and friends in Northeast Asia, that we could work out and manage ways that, that it could take place.
Well, since Korea and China's serious concern over Japan's pushing for collective self-defense, what do you think, why Prime Minister Abe is forging ahead? Why is he doing this?
The exercise of the right of collective self-defense has very symbolic implications if we consider the historical reconciliation issues between Japan and other neighboring Asian countries. In addition to that, well, in accordance with the United Nations Charter, Japan and Germany is still enemy states.
Right.
So, but however, if you look at the activities of the two defeaters in the World War II, with regard to the contribution to the international peace and security, well, Germany made a sincere, regrets and made a sincere apology to the victims of the war, but Japan did not. So, and Germany, well, when it comes to the participation in the peacekeeping operations or other peace operations, they are focused on the provision of logistics rather than dispatching their military units into the combat zone. But the thing is that, well, in case of Japan, Japan wants to dispatch the military units to a combat zone under the name of the collective self-defense. So these two different stories, created concerns, especially from the states who were victimized by the Japanese colonialship.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Pinkston, in your opinion, why is Abe bulldozing through this move?
Well, I think there are a couple of things at work here. I mean, one is the changing security environment, of course, and rising threat perceptions, and rising China and military modernization in China. China's, some people call it tailored coercion, the action in the South China Sea and over the Taiyu Shinkaku Islands, and North Korean nuclear threat. So Japan, I think Prime Minister Abe and Japanese government sincerely feel they have to respond. They have to take some defensive actions, and they're trying to deal with that within the constraints of the legal constraints and constitutional constraints. So there's that. But also, I think some things have fundamentally changed in Japan after the Fukushima nuclear accident. There was a big wake-up call, and there was a realization that unimaginable emergencies could happen. You know, people had been lulled into this complacency after about half a century of this peaceful Japan that had been secluded from the dangers of the international system. And I think people feel they have to be ready for certain scenarios. So, for example, people who were in the military in Japan, that was a low prestige type of job or career. But now, after they saw the military response in the self-defense forces in collaboration with the US military, for example, in responding to the disaster of the earthquake and the nuclear accident, that people's perceptions of the military and role of the military have fundamentally changed. And I think they believe that they have to move closer to this so-called normal country where they can exercise their rights to self-defense.
Well, Japan wants to exercise the right to the collective self-defense in case of an emergency, such as war on the Korean peninsula. And should we interpret this as Japan picking Korea as a potential target?
Well, people jump to that conclusion, and they move to that scenario possibility, which is of course, a very important one. But I think we have to move back and think in a more generic sense and look at the spectrum of security threats, both traditional and non-traditional security threats, threats posed by state actors and non-state actors. And some of us who study international relations and conflict kind of look back at the Cold War and think how much more simple it was. So things are not so easy or simple anymore. And I think we have to look at a number of scenarios or possibilities and ways that we could respond. And there are a lot of potential threats where there's clear convergence and agreement on there has to be a response. If things are disrupted, or where trade is disrupted, or there's panic in markets in East Asia, any kind, terrorist attacks, or any of these kinds of things, the use of a nuclear weapon, for example, any of these things, everyone has an interest, at least the good guys, have an interest in preventing these types of catastrophes. So I think we have to look at this broad spectrum of security threats and think of ways to cooperate, or that we can cooperate on case-by-case basis, and then move forward from there.
Dr. Shin, you have an opinion on this?
Well, actually, if South Korea has the capacity to defend our nations with our own capacity, so there is no need to, allow the, visits of the foreign military units into the Korean territory. But the reality is a little bit different. So because, the panel reports clearly indicated that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons and, making progress on the delivery means as well. So given these situations, we need a certain alliance in order to defend South Korean nationals as well as the territory of South Korea. So in that sense, this kind of exercise of the right of self-defense by Japan would be beneficial to South Korea. But there is one clear preconditions. The possibility of military intervention by Japan under the name of the collective self-defense, there must be a clear, declaration of that South Korea is under attack. And then South Korea invite the other, the forces of other countries, so which is called prior consent. So if there is no, there are no these two preconditions, Japan may not be involved in the war even on the Korean Peninsula, even they have alliance treaty with the United States.
But some of the concerns that some South Korean officials do have is that because the wartime operational command is in Washington's hands when it comes to South Korean military situation, does that throw South Korea out of the picture then when it comes to a case of emergency?
So this kind of understanding comes from the confusions between war and combat. So when it comes to the allowance for the visit of other armies, foreign armies into the territory, it is totally dependent upon the consent of the state. This consent is very comprehensive. But when it comes to the OPCON, it's dealing with operations in a specific combat. So if there is no comprehensive consent from the state, then, well, we can exclude any possibilities of the, U.S.'s, consent that Japan can play a role on the Korean Peninsula. It's impossible.
Oh, it's impossible if South Korea doesn't want Japanese military to come and help.
Yes.
We can say no.
It's in a different dimension.
Okay, and was that your understanding as well, Dr.
Yes, I don't see any thinking or planning or anything else that there's going to be Japanese military forces and personnel coming to Korea under any kind of conflict scenario. All of the planning includes U.S. forces and then the sending states from the United Nations Command, the 16 countries. So there are other allies that are prepared to assist if the Republic of Korea comes under attack, including military personnel, Canada, Australia, the UK, Denmark, NATO. Other NATO countries, I think, would respond if the Republic of Korea came under attack from North Korea, for example. So I don't think it's necessary. I don't think anybody's planning for that. So those kind of worries, I think, are a little bit misplaced.
A little bit stretched there.
I think so.
Now, let's take a moment here to talk to Mr. Alan Romberg. He is the Distinguished Fellow and Director of the East Asia Program at the Stimson Center in Washington. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, what kind of impact do you think this will have on the region, in the region?
I don't think that the net effect in real terms will be bad. I think certainly from an American point of view, it will help with the alliance management and implementation. Obviously, there are sensitivities in terms of Korea and China, that is Japan's neighbors. And I think Japan needs to spend some real time talking with its neighbors to reassure them and explain to them what this is all about. But in the end, I don't think this is going to be a damaging thing. I think it'll be potentially a quite helpful thing.
The U.S. wants to strengthen its trilateral alliance with South Korea and Japan, but collective self-defense issue is sure to add friction to already frayed Korea-Japan ties. What role do you see the U.S. playing in the mending relations between Seoul and Tokyo?
I would argue that both the government of Korea and Japan need to really think hard and reach out to each other and find a way forward to deal with these problems that they've had over history and so on and so forth. I'm not sure I would say that the U.S. looks for a trilateral alliance, but it certainly looks for cooperation among the U.S., Japan, and Korea, because with that kind of cooperation, that kind of collective strength, the possibility for maintaining peace and stability in the East Asian, Northeast Asian region is greatly enhanced. And so, yes, the sensitivities that you mentioned are real. and they need to be dealt with by all concerned. But the goal is to maintain peace and stability, which is what everybody will benefit from in the region.
All right, thank you for your analysis. That was Dr. Alan Romberg from the Stimson Center. And now we go to Dr. Paul Mitford. He's the Director of Japan Program at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. Now, Dr. Mitford, are there any risk factors for Japan in pursuing this idea?
In many ways, the biggest risk factor is actually for Japan itself. It runs the risk of maybe ending up in being entrapped in wars it doesn't want to be involved with. This was particularly a big danger 10 years ago when the Bush administration was trying to expand Japan's involvement in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's a danger that Japan might be asked or pressured by the U.S. to get involved in combat in third countries and in conflicts that really are not in Japan's interest. So that's probably the biggest risk of reinterpreting the Constitution.
Now, as for South Korea, some people here in South Korea are worried because given the past history between the two nations, does Seoul need to be cautious here?
I know that the public in South Korea is quite suspicious of Japan based on historical memory. I think there are a lot of people in South Korea who can continue to see Japan as a potential threat. And therefore, I think this creates some suspicion. My experience is that Korean officials who've spent a lot of time in Japan and have spent a lot of time with Japan's military tend to be more trusting of Japan and its military than those who have less exposure. But in any case, the legacy of history does color threat perceptions towards Japan even now, I would argue.
Thank you for your time today. That was Dr. Paul Mitford. He's the Director of Japan Program at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology. Now, as Dr. Mitford mentioned, the realistic impact will likely be limited in his opinion, but certainly it got the attention of China. Then where does South Korea come into the dynamic? I guess this question is a little bit more in terms of politics than the security situation in the region.
So, well, actually, Japan will bet on the United States by allowing a lot of, assistance, military assistance in the case of the emergencies against, China. Because, well, Japan has this maritime disputes with China. So if you look at the panel reports, there are detailed descriptions on how to, protect a certain, isolated islands from Japan. So we can say, well, China is the prime target of the exercise of the collective self-defense. But the thing is that, well, in case of Korea, well, we are facing nuclear North Korea. So we need the regional cooperations from China, United States, Japan, even from Russia. So we have to be very neutral on that sense. So I think, well, collective self-defense argument by Japan may have impact, adverse impact on solving the denuclearization of North Korean issue. So that's we have to be very concerned about in terms of the, as you mentioned, the political, atmosphere here in Northeast Asia.
Well, Japan's position could stoke an arms race in this region and inflame tensions. What do you think about this situation if Japan pushes for this so-called their self-defense?
Well, actually, I don't think it is a little bit unimaginable that Japanese leadership can achieve their goals by just, well, reinterpreting the constitutions. They will face a lot of, oppositions from the public as well as other, opposition parties. But however, if Shinzo Abe achieves his goals, then he will be supported by his nationalistic, counterpartners in Japan, and then it will create a certain tensions with neighboring states because, well, Japan has territorial disputes with all the neighboring states, with Russia, with South Korea, with China. So in that case, it is inevitable to face the arms races in Northeast Asia. But however, I firmly believe that this kind of interpretation cannot be accepted by the general public of the Japanese. So when it comes to the fact that, when you consider the fact that Japan is a democratic society.
And let's now go over to Ms. Mindy Cutler. She is the Director of Asia Policy Point. Ms. Cutler, most experts in Washington seem to support Japan's initiative, but you seem to think differently.
I have. I do believe that this move by Abe is a bit premature for a number of reasons. One, I'm a bit suspicious as to why he is making this such an important issue when there are so many other things that Japan has to work on. To focus on a constitutional issue makes one hesitate. Second, Japan essentially has operated as it has the right to collective self-defense. It has in the past always sort of sidestepped, not necessarily reinterpreted, but sidestepped when convenient and resurrected when necessary, the kind of security relationships that can be interpreted as collective self-defense. And most important, he is going about trying to revise the Constitution in a way that is not only unconstitutional, but against the wishes of the Japanese people, and Japan is supposed to be a democracy. He is short-circuiting the procedures. There's a level of arrogance toward the Japanese democracy and condescension to the Japanese Constitution that is troubling at best.
How can Japan peacefully convince South Korea and China to accept this plan?
Many of Japan's allies and surrounding countries still feel uncomfortable with what Japan did 70 years ago. And they do not feel that there were adequate apologies, and more important, not adequate acknowledgement. And Abe and his cabinet represent the pinnacle, if you could say, of denier history in Japan. They don't believe that the war was an aggressive war. They don't believe they were responsible for atrocities. They don't believe that they started the war. So they don't have a perspective, a normal perspective on the use of force, on the use of, even the use of the word aggression. So until the Japanese government and the Japanese leaders are statesmanlike and understand their responsibilities, which needs to come before any redefinition of what Japan is as a normal country in sense of security matters, in sense of military matters. Japan needs to be a normal country. It has to have normal aspirations and normal understanding of the 21st century. And that has not come across with the Abe administration. They're mired in the past, and in a past that does not make Japan look good, and decisions didn't go well. So things are very troubling. Japan will have to go a much longer, harder distance to disavow itself from its past.
All right, thank you very much. That was Ms. Mindy Cutler, the Director of Asia Policy Point in the United States. We have another expert actually standing by, Dr. Bruce Bennett from the US-based RAND Corporation. Dr. Bennett, thank you very much for joining us today. So why is Washington, we've discussed it many times here in the studio, but why is Washington open arms about Japan's move to exercise collective self-defense?
Well, I think we have to recognize that for the United States to participate in anything in Northeast Asia we have to have basing abilities in Japan, in South Korea, and elsewhere in the region. But Japan is key to that for us to meet even our security agreements with Korea. Without a collective self-agreement or self-defense arrangement with Japan, Japan could be impaired in its ability to give the United States the basing that we would need. So for U.S. participation in the region, this development by Prime Minister Abe is actually critical to our being able to be involved in the region.
What would be the best way for Tokyo to reach out and assuage the concerns of its neighbors?
I think Tokyo needs to talk more with its neighbors, with South Korea, with China, and try to develop a mutual understanding of their needs in order to be able to allow the U.S. to operate from their bases. I think with China in particular, we need to explain China's number one objective in the region is to avoid war. The best way to avoid war in the region is to keep a rather irresponsible North Korean regime from being too aggressive. If the United States can operate within the region, especially from bases in South Korea and Japan, then it is less likely that North Korea is going to be irresponsible, and China will achieve its objective of not facing a war in the region.
All right, thank you very much, Doctor. That was Dr. Bruce Bennett from the U.S.-based RAND Corporation. Now, Dr. Bennett mentioned it as well, but what needs to be done to actually ease any possible tensions in Japan, from Japan's perspective? I mean, China, it seems like they will not back down on this issue.
So because of the historical legacy, I mean, historic reconciliation issues, it would be really difficult to predict that there may be a certain, I mean, mutual understanding on the exercise of the right of collective self-defense in Northeast Asia by Japan. But there is a certain, I mean, affirmative side when you read the panel reports. So it is dealing a lot of, I mean, collective security, as I already mentioned. So Japan has already made a lot of contribution to the peacekeeping operations in this world. So if the discussion of Japanese government are confined to this kind of security, I mean collective security, rather than collective self-defense, or otherwise when it comes to the collective self-defense, their, I mean, activities just to confine to provisions of the fuels and waters and logistics, then it would not create any kind of, I mean, tensions among the regional states. So what I want is that a step-by-step approaches. So first of all, they have to have a persistent methodology to persuade the neighboring states by talking about the collective security rather than collective self-defense. And then they can, after building up a certain trust among the nations, they can easily talk about the, I mean, expansion of the right of collective self-defense.
Dr. Pinkston, do you think there is a chance there where China and South Korea will be convinced by Japan if they do take the step that Dr. Shin mentioned?
I hope so. I'm hopeful in the future, for the future. If we think back 100 years ago or so in Europe, people would have never thought that Germany and France, for example, would be able to reconcile. But today, war between Germany and France is unthinkable. So I hope this historical reconciliation can take place. I think there needs to be more efforts taken to do that. So that's one part of the problem, or one piece of the puzzle. The other is, I think, a little bit worrisome, the dispute management or dispute resolution problem in the South China Sea, for example, in the region. We could be reaching a tipping point where, you know, the use of force and coercion might be the preferred method here, or are disputes going to be settled according to international law and to peaceful diplomacy and so forth? We have a case that the Philippines has filed, for example, over disputed shoals in South China Sea. And if China continues to ignore this diplomatic and legal process and uses force and coercion, we could be moving down this path where neighbors and others will take similar actions, and that could be very, very worrisome.
What should we focus on in relation to obvious push for the right to collective self-defense?
I think, well, the reason for pushing for the collective self-defense is kind of, I mean, as already Dr. Pinkston already mentioned, you know, Japan wants to, I mean, be a normal state. In accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations, every state has the inherent right of individual and collective self-defense. So, as a member state to the United Nations, even well, though even if Japan is not a member of the United Nations, Japan has the inherent right of collective self-defense. But the thing is that, well, there are so many ways to make contributions to the international peace and security, even without exercising the right of collective self-defense. So, as I already mentioned, the collective self-defense is kind of unilateral, I mean, use of force, which has not been checked and balanced by the United Nations Security Council. So this kind of, I mean, the allowance for the collective self-defense is shattering the originals and the origins and the basis of the Japanese Constitution after the World War II. So how the leadership can shatter this origins of the Constitution just by reinterpretation. So we have to be very cautious about this fact. So, and that gets why, I mean, as I already told you, as a democratic society in which I mean, complies in good faith with their own constitution, I think there must be a certain, I mean, revision mechanisms, revision procedures must be involved in collecting the, I mean, opinions from, in order to collect the opinions from the general publics in Japan as well.
And Dr. Shin, your point is exactly in line with Japan's new Komeito party. And so, where should we place the most emphasis in this issue overall then?
Well, I think to follow up what Dr. Shin said, the legal foundations are very important, but in reality, to convene the UN Security Council or to obtain UN Security Council authorization for the use of force, in many cases, there would just be no time for that. If we're talking about missile attacks, for example, or other types of threats where a large number of lives could be at stake, and there would be no opportunity to go through all of those legal procedures, and that any responsible leader will be compelled to act. So I think we have to think of those scenarios in the realistic nature of modern threats and complex threats. And so to have that discussion where there's a convergence of interest to enable Japan to use its capabilities, I think that's responsible, it's a natural discussion, but of course it should not be abused or used for some other nefarious purposes. And I think that discussion can be had and the details can be worked out. And so that's what we should focus on and realize that there are conditions where maybe Japanese self-defense forces may be in a situation to act that's in the security interests of all the actors in the region.
All right. Thank you very much, both of you, for coming to the studio and sharing your thoughts with us today.
Good to be here.
And that's all we have for you today. If you have any questions, you can visit our website at arirang.co.kr.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.